Life in solitary confinement. 10 years without a voice. The sound of silence. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button, drop a like if you believe every voice deserves to be heard, and share this story so the world never forgets what silence can do to a human mind. The story begins inside the Pelican Bay State Prison, a fortress of concrete and razor wire built on the edge of California's cold northern coast. The air there was thick with the smell of salt and rust, and the cries of distant seagulls were often drowned out by the clang of steel doors. It was here that Cesar Francisco Villa, inmate number C74291, began his descent into silence. When Cesar first entered the Security Housing Unit, or SHU, he believed it would last a few months, a disciplinary measure for what prison officials called gang association. There was no trial, no clear evidence, just suspicion. The guards handed him a thin blanket, a dull pencil, and a packet of rules thicker than his mattress. Then the steel door slammed shut behind him and the world outside ceased to exist. The cell was 8 by 10 feet, gray concrete on all sides, a metal bunk, a stainless steel toilet, and a slot in the door no larger than a book. No window. No mirror. No human touch. For 23 hours a day, Cesar lived in stillness so deep that even his own breathing began to sound like an intruder. The only light came from a fluorescent tube that hummed faintly above him, a reminder that he was not forgotten, only watched. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. The silence was not quiet. It was loud, alive, pulsing in his ears like a second heartbeat. When the guards delivered food through the slot, he tried to speak, to say thank you, to say hello, but the words would stick in his throat. After months without hearing another voice, Cesar began to wonder if he still had one. He started counting. The cracks in the wall, the bolts in the bed frame, the steps it took from one side of the cell to the other. 43 steps back and forth. That was his universe. When his mind wandered, he would imagine voices from his past. His mother calling him home for dinner, his brother laughing, the echo of street sounds from the world he once knew. But those memories grew faint, like whispers underwater. In his 4th year, something inside him began to shift. He started hearing things that weren't there. A faint tapping, a child's giggle, footsteps pacing outside the cell at midnight. Sometimes he'd speak to the shadows just to remember what it felt like. He'd whisper, "Can you hear me?" and the silence would mock him back. Cesar wasn't alone in this torment. There were hundreds like him, men locked away in neighboring cells, invisible to one another. Some tried to communicate through codes, tapping on the walls in patterns that meant hello, stay strong, or still alive. But when guards discovered the tapping, punishments followed, more isolation, more silence. The walls of Pelican Bay swallowed sound like a grave. Every once in a while, the steel door would open for yard time. Yard was a concrete pen the size of a garage, open to the sky but surrounded by walls too high to see beyond. There were no trees, no grass, only sky, and even that seemed distant. Cesar would stretch his arms upward, feeling sunlight on his face for the first time in weeks. But even that brief taste of freedom felt cruel. The moment the door clanged shut behind him again, the silence returned like a storm. Letters from his family stopped coming after the 2nd year. Some were lost, some censored, and others perhaps never written. Cesar wrote anyway, filling page after page with words that might never be read. His handwriting grew shaky, his sentences repetitive, sometimes just a single phrase over and over, "I am still here." In the 6th year, his mind began playing tricks. He saw faces in the concrete, shadows forming human shapes that vanished when he blinked. He spoke to them, gave them names, Luis, Maria, the boy. They were his company in the silence. He told them stories about his childhood, about freedom, about food that wasn't served on plastic trays. The imaginary became his only reality. There were nights when he'd wake up screaming, his throat raw, his heart pounding, unsure if he'd actually made a sound. In solitary, sound didn't travel far. It died the moment it was born. By the 9th year, Cesar had forgotten what his own voice truly sounded like. When the psychologist came for his routine mental evaluation, she found a man who stared blankly, responding only with gestures. The system labeled him uncooperative, but the truth was simpler. He had forgotten how to speak. In that silence, Cesar found a kind of twisted peace. He stopped fighting the emptiness and started living inside it. He would sit cross-legged on the cold floor, close his eyes, and listen to the faint hum of the light, the only sound left that proved the world still existed. He didn't know it yet, but the silence was beginning to break. Outside those walls, whispers of protest were spreading, from inmates who refused their meals, from families demanding justice, from journalists uncovering what Pelican Bay had tried so hard to hide. The world was beginning to hear the voices of the voiceless. But for Caesar, trapped in the concrete tomb of the SHU, the 10th year would be the hardest. The year when silence would either destroy him completely or force him to remember what it meant to be human. The hunger strike. Before we continue, hit that like button and subscribe if you believe the world should hear the stories they tried to silence. Every click helps bring light into the darkest corners of the system. By the time Cesar Francisco Villa reached his 10th year in solitary confinement, his sense of time had unraveled completely. Mornings and nights no longer existed, only the constant drone of the fluorescent light that hung above his head. His beard had grown long, his hands calloused from tracing the same patterns on the walls, and his eyes, once alive with anger, had settled into a distant stillness. Outside his cell, something was shifting. It started quietly, rumors passed through the air vents, a coded rhythm of taps echoing from one cell to another. 2 knocks, pause, 1 knock. It meant change. For the first time in years, Caesar felt a tremor of life in the silence. The inmates were planning something. Across the SHU, other prisoners, men who had lived invisible lives like him, had reached their breaking point. They had been buried alive for years, labeled gang members without trial, stripped of every human connection. But a spark had spread through the concrete maze of Pelican Bay. They were going to refuse food, not for days but until someone outside those walls finally listened. Caesar didn't eat the breakfast tray that slid under his door that morning. The oatmeal was cold, the bread hard, but hunger wasn't what haunted him. It was the idea that no one cared. This time he would make them care. By day 2, the air in the SHU began to change. The usual clang of trays and chatter of guards fell into eerie silence. The prison staff noticed quickly. Guards walked down the hallway with clipboards, calling out names, demanding answers. "You planning to starve yourself, Villa?" one shouted through the slot. Caesar stared at the wall and said nothing. It was the first time in years he chose silence as a weapon. Days passed. The taps between cells grew louder. Messages of solidarity, defiance, pain. "Stay strong. Don't give in. We matter." Some men fainted by the 5th day. Others were taken away on stretchers, their bodies too weak to stand. The guards tried to isolate the ringleaders, cutting off communication, but it was too late. Word had reached the general population, and from there, it escaped the walls. Families of inmates began to speak out. Activists gathered outside Pelican Bay, holding signs that read, "End the torture," and "We are human too." Caesar, who had almost forgotten his own name, was now part of something far greater than himself. His weakness became his strength. For years he had lived without a voice, but now his silence was being heard across California. By the 2nd week, the prison administration began force-feeding some of the men through tubes. Medical staff entered the SHU wearing masks, their eyes cold, performing procedures under orders. Caesar resisted, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had lost nearly 20 pounds, but he refused to stop. He knew that this pain for the first time might mean something. Late one night, he heard a guard mutter to another, "They've got the media on this now. Sacramento's watching." That was the moment Caesar realized something had changed. For years, he begged for a voice, and now the world was beginning to listen. Reporters from across the country started writing about Pelican Bay's torture units. Human rights groups compared the conditions to psychological warfare. Photos leaked of the narrow concrete cells, the isolation cages used for yard time, the men pacing alone like ghosts. The world was horrified, but the Department of Corrections insisted it was necessary for safety. The hunger strike spread beyond Pelican Bay, to prisons in Los Angeles, Fresno, even San Quentin. Thousands joined in solidarity. Some were serving life sentences, others just months, but all demanded the same thing: an end to indefinite solitary confinement. Inside his cell, Caesar could feel the system beginning to tremble. The guards' routines changed. Officials visited the SHU more frequently. The warden himself appeared one morning, his voice amplified through the corridor. "This ends today," he shouted. "You're only hurting yourselves." But for men who had already endured 10 years of living death, threats meant nothing. By day 17, Caesar's lips were cracked, his tongue dry. His vision blurred, and he often spoke to the walls as though they were listening. Yet even in delirium he refused to eat. He imagined his mother's face, the sound of rain, the touch of wind. He wanted the world outside to remember those things he'd been denied. One night, as he lay on the cold floor, he heard something faint, a voice through the vent, trembling but determined. "We did it," it said. "They're coming tomorrow." Caesar didn't know if it was real or another hallucination, but he clung to it with the last ounce of his strength. The next morning, guards opened the doors not to deliver trays, but to escort medical teams and reporters. Caesar blinked against the light as cameras flashed for the first time in years. The faces of journalists and lawyers filled the corridor, their eyes wide with disbelief at the sight of men who looked like shadows of themselves. That night, when the door slammed shut again, Caesar sat in silence, trembling but alive. For the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It was heavy, with purpose, with history, with the sound of voices finally echoing beyond the walls of Pelican Bay. He didn't know how much longer he could survive, but he knew the world could no longer pretend he didn't exist. For 10 years they had taken his voice. But now, even without speaking, he had been heard. The sound of freedom. When the hunger strike ended after 60 grueling days, Cesar Francisco Villa weighed barely more than a memory. His bones pressed against his skin like brittle branches, his eyes hollow yet burning with a quiet fire. But something profound had changed, not just inside him but inside the system that had caged him for a decade. News outlets from across the country had plastered headlines about the Pelican Bay hunger strike, calling it a rebellion of the forgotten. 4 years the SHU had been sealed off from public scrutiny, but now the world had seen it. Its gray corridors, its soundless cells, its living ghosts. The pressure built. Lawsuits poured in. Politicians demanded answers. Human rights organizations called it torture. In 2015, California officials finally agreed to a settlement. Indefinite solitary confinement would end. Thousands of inmates would be reviewed and, if safe, moved into general population. The world called it progress. Inside it felt like resurrection. For Caesar, the day the guards came for him was like stepping into sunlight after a lifetime in the dark. His door opened, not for yard time, not for medical checks, but for freedom or something close to it. He hesitated before stepping out, his feet unsure of what open space meant anymore. The hallway seemed impossibly wide, the ceiling unbearably high. The guard who led him said little. "You're being transferred?" he muttered, eyes fixed ahead. "Program's over." Caesar didn't respond. His voice still felt like a stranger to him. As he walked through the corridors of Pelican Bay, the echoes of his own footsteps startled him. For years, he'd heard nothing but the hum of lights and the scrape of metal doors. Now, every sound felt like an explosion. Keys jangling, radios crackling, the distant murmur of human voices. When they brought him to a regular prison yard, the sun hit his face in full force. He winced, tears welling unbidden. The sky seemed too blue, the air too open. Men played basketball, others lifted weights, some simply stood, staring. He could barely believe they were allowed to talk, to touch, to exist together. A younger inmate approached him cautiously. "You're one of the SHU guys, right?" he asked. "From Pelican Bay?" Caesar nodded slowly. His lips trembled before sound came out, a hoarse whisper. "Yeah." It was the first word he'd spoken aloud in nearly a decade. The young man smiled faintly. "Welcome back, man." Those 2 words, "welcome back," hit him harder than any punishment ever had. For 10 years no one had welcomed him anywhere. He sat down on the bench, feeling the warmth of sunlight soak into his skin. For the first time in years he felt alive. But freedom, even partial, came with ghosts. The nights were still hard. When the lights went out, Caesar would jolt awake, convinced he was back in his cell. His hands would trace the air, expecting to feel concrete just inches from his face. Sometimes he'd speak to himself, whispering into the darkness just to make sure his voice still worked. A prison psychologist visited him weekly, helping him relearn how to communicate. Simple things, eye contact, tone, conversation, had become foreign. When she asked him how he survived all those years in silence, he paused for a long time before replying. "I made friends with the sound of nothing," he said softly. At some point, it became the only thing that didn't leave. Outside the prison walls, activists continued their fight. The hunger strike had inspired new laws, new oversight, and global awareness. But for the men who lived it, the scars were invisible. Many, like Caesar, struggled to adapt. Some were released only to find the outside world louder and faster than they could bear. The silence they once hated had become the only thing they understood. Months passed. Caesar began writing again. His letters, once desperate and broken, now carried a quiet strength. He wrote not just for himself, but for the men who never made it out of the SHU. "We were buried alive," he wrote in one of his final letters. "But the world dug us up with their eyes. Every time someone speaks our names, every time someone tells our story, that's another breath we get back." In 2017, Caesar was transferred to a lower security facility. He began mentoring younger inmates, teaching them meditation and writing therapy. The same silence that once tormented him had become his discipline, a reminder of how fragile the mind can be and how strong it must become to survive. One afternoon, while walking in the yard, he stopped and closed his eyes. The wind brushed against his face, carrying the sound of laughter, shouts, and life. For 10 years, he had lived without a voice, without connection, without touch. Now, even surrounded by fences and guards, he felt something close to freedom. He whispered to himself, the words trembling but sure. "I can hear again." The silence had not won. And though Pelican Bay's walls still stood taller than ever, their secrets could no longer hide. The voices of the men it tried to silence had escaped, and they would echo forever in the conscience of a world that almost forgot them.